I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to the Conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. Got a great program, a great conversation. I think you're going to enjoy it. I'm looking forward to it. I just met Robin Bernstein, and she's been focusing on the question of prisons, among other things. But we're going to talk about her work as an author, a cultural historian, and a professor. Her materials indicate that she's a cultural historian who specializes in race and racism from the 19th century to the present. She teaches at Harvard, where she is the Dillon Professor of American History and Professor of African and African American Studies and of Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality. She wrote Freeman's Challenge, the murder that shook America's original prison for profit, with fellowships from the National Endowment of the Humanities and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Bernstein's previous book, Racial Innocence, Performing American Childhood from Slavery to Civil Rights, won 5 awards. She's also written a Jewish feminist children's book, many prize-winning articles and op-eds and essays in the New York Times, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and other venues. And she recently received the Everett Mendelssohn Excellence in Mentoring Award. Robin, Professor Bernstein, welcome to the conversation. And you've given me permission to call you Robin, and I will do that. How are you doing?
Thank you so much. I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And the question of slavery is a big one that we need to sit with. Let me just have you talk about how you are coming to the research, why this grabbed your attention as a scholar, and what conclusions broadly are you sharing with people about the prison system, prison for profit in this country?
Mm-hmm. Well, I came to write this book, Freeman's Challenge, because I learned a couple of things that really surprised me. And I thought, well, if these things are surprising to me, they're going to be surprising to other people as well. I kind of stumbled across the story of William Freeman, who was a 15-year-old, a teenager, African-American and Native American. He was in 1840 accused of a horse theft that he swore he did not commit. And he was sentenced to 5 years hard labor in the Auburn State Prison, where he was forced to work in factories that were actually built into the prison. He was forced to build animal harnesses. And these factories were run by private companies who took the labor of the incarcerated people. They paid the prison for that labor. The incarcerated people got no cut whatsoever. And then the consumer goods that they manufactured were sold on the open market, sold to consumers. And this all happened in New York State in the 1840s. And when I found this story, I thought, wait a minute, what? There was convict leasing in New York State in the North in the 1840s, a quarter century before the Civil War. And I found this so surprising because, like a lot of people, I associated convict leasing and profit-driven incarceration with the South. After the Civil War, we've heard about how convict leasing is, quote, slavery by another name, unquote. And we've heard about how profit-driven prison was a way to re-enslave African Americans after the 13th Amendment, which outlawed forced labor, quote, except as a punishment for crime. So I said, wait a minute, how could this be happening in New York State? I'm from New York. This is my northern state. How could this be happening in New York State in the 1840s? And what I learned when I started doing this research, what I learned was that, in fact, it was the North, not the South, that invented profit-driven incarceration in this country. And it was slavery by another name. It was a way of re-enslaving African Americans, but this was invented not in the wake of Southern slavery after the Civil War. It was actually invented in the wake of Northern slavery. And in New York State, Northern slavery ended half a century before it ended in the South. And that's why prison for profit was actually created in the North, not the South. And the reason that I felt so compelled to tell this story, besides the fact that William Freeman is an extraordinary person and I wanted to bring him to public attention, but another reason was that when we start the story of prison for profit in the South, when we start the story with the Civil War, we're starting the story in the middle. And the problem with that is that when we do that, we are letting the North off the hook. What I wanted to do in Freeman's Challenge is put the North back on the hook.
That's amazing. So talk about the question of slavery in the North. Slavery was an American institution, concentrated and marketed later as a Southern franchise, but actually it was broader than that. So talk about how slavery changed in the entire country from the beginning of the country to when it became outlawed in certain northern states. What's that story?
Sure. Well, the story is, I mean, obviously it begins with the slave trade, with the Atlantic slave trade in 1619, and it begins with the kidnapping and the forced enslavement of Africans, and it comes to the North, it comes to the South, in basically up and down the eastern coast of the United States, and then it spreads. So in the North, it took hold in almost every state in the North, and it was legal in almost every state. And then it also moved through the South. It moved eventually to the West. And depending on how you define slavery, it has been in either most states in the United States or arguably all states in the United States, especially if you start thinking about things like carceral slavery, which is something that I know we're going to be talking about a lot when we're thinking about forced labor. So forced labor for no pay. So in terms of African-American slavery in the North, it was throughout the North, it was chattel slavery, meaning that it was passed down from mother to child. If the mother was enslaved, then the child was enslaved. And then the North started a process called gradual emancipation. Gradual emancipation in New York State specifically, which is the focus of Freeman's Challenge. In New York State in particular, the process began in the late 18th century, so the late 1700s. And what it did, a series of laws were enacted that freed nobody. Nobody was initially freed through a gradual emancipation in New York. But what happened was that the children of enslaved mothers were technically free, but they were forced into indentured servitude for a period of decades. They were forced to serve the enslavers of their mothers. So what this meant specifically for William Freeman's family, and for many, many other African-American families throughout the North, was that people in the same family became free at different moments in their lives. And so you had these mixed status families where everybody had different rights. So in the case of William Freeman's family, his grandparents were enslaved. They had two children who were born before 1799. That was the cutoff year in New York State. Before 1799, they had two children. So those children were born enslaved. Then they had two more children who were born after 1799. So those children were free but indentured. And then the enslaved children and the enslaved parents actually became freed by their enslavers over a period of about a decade. Meanwhile, the supposedly free children remained indentured. So you had these bizarre situations, these crazy-making situations where everybody had a different status, everybody had a different set of rights. And in Freeman's case, in Freeman's family's case, the children who were born nominally free were actually the last children in the family to become free. So you had these very, very difficult situations. William Freeman was the next generation. He was born of a father who had been born enslaved and had become free. And William Freeman was always free until 1840, when he was incarcerated in the original profit-driven prison in Auburn, New York. And that is when arguably he was enslaved.
So how did families operate? I'm just trying to imagine if they're in a household and maybe some way or another bound to the household by the contract or by enslavement. How did that work? Do you know? Did you look into that? What?
Oh, of course. Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, it's enormously difficult. I mean, one of the
Hmm.
problems with, one of the many, many problems with slavery. I mean, we can name
Hmm.
so many problems with slavery, so many
Hmm.
reasons why slavery is an evil system. Of the many, many reasons, one of them is that slavery prevents parents from protecting their children. And this was true in the North and the South. If you are an enslaved parent, you do not actually have the ultimate authority over your own children. You don't get to say what your children can or can't do. You don't get to say how your children will or will not be punished. And this was absolutely the case in William Freeman's family. So it's enormously difficult. At the same time, what we know is that enslaved people have always had agency. Enslaved people have always resisted. Enslaved people have always found creative and beautiful and joyous ways to build loving families, even under the most dire of circumstances. So that was the case in William Freeman's family as well. William Freeman's grandparents, Harry and Kate, were forced to build the city that became Auburn, or build the town that became the city that became Auburn. They were forced to build this to benefit white people, but simultaneously, they built a Black community. They built a Black community. They built a neighborhood that was called New Guinea, and this was part of Auburn. And so, and this was a thriving, vibrant community that William Freeman grew up in. So these are the paradoxes of slavery. On the one hand, it is a truly evil form of oppression, and at the same time, African Americans have always found ways to resist and ways to build beautiful families within it.
Do you look at the whole process of policing, the philosophy of policing, because it obviously leads to, the end product is capturing and delivering the product to a prison,
Mhm,
right? The product being a human being,
mhm.
in this case, a Black man, uh, most often. And so, what was the relationship between institutions that adjudicated and institutions that captured, uh, apprehended, arrested, and delivered human beings for the new enslavement? How did that look?
Yeah. Well, the organized policing did not really exist in Auburn, in central New York State, at the time of William Freeman was alive. So what we would think of as police was more like a kind of semi-disorganized set of sheriffs and constables and various people in various roles. It was much more improvisational than what we
Hmm.
might visualize now. In the South, policing actually grew out of organized quote unquote slave catchers.
Hmm.
So, quote unquote slave catchers were a highly organized set of white men who set out to perpetuate slavery and to prevent people from escaping slavery. And a lot in a lot of cases in the South, those practices actually evolved directly into what we recognize as a modern police force. That was a little bit less true in New York State.
Well, I bring it up because we often hear in community a critique of the police work, the work of police, the public safety mandate, and the cynics among us will say, you know what, this is kind of par for the course. We look at the reason this apparatus was put in place, and it was for the oppression and
Mhm.
suppression and control of Black people. So it follows that we still are looked at and are treated with a certain, um, inhumaneness because the
Mhm.
system that
Mhm.
was created uh, argued against the validity of our being human beings.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so,
Absolutely.
and so for profit prisons, what's the seed of that idea and how did it
Ah,
emerge?
yeah, that is exactly what this book is about. So, the idea that a prison should be an economic force, the idea that one person's incarceration can and should economically benefit another person, that is a really bizarre idea. And what my research shows is that that idea actually had an origin point. And the origin point is Auburn, New York.
Hmm.
So this is a specific prison, the Auburn State Prison in New York State. This was the prison that invented this bizarre idea. And there were specific people who created this idea. Basically, the way where this all came from, where this evil, horrible system that we are still struggling with today, where it actually came from, was in the very early 1800s. New York State was looking to build a prison, and the state offered $20,000, which is the equivalent of about $500,000 today, to some sort of township, to an area that would build this prison. So it was basically a $20,000 bribe to build a prison. And the money was intended to actually go toward the physical construction of the prison.
Mm-hmm.
But there were a group of white businessmen in Auburn, New York, and they had a radical new idea. Their idea was they could take this money, use it to build the prison, not because they actually wanted a prison, certainly not because they actually gave a darn about justice. That was definitely not what was on their minds.
Mm-hmm.
But they thought, if we take this money and we use this money as it is intended to build a prison, that's going to bring all kinds of workers to our tiny little town. It's going to bring all kinds of commerce to the town. And then there's going to be more money coming in every year forever to run the prison. And that's also going to stimulate the local economy. Now, to us, that's obvious. But at the time, this was a radical new idea. Nobody had come up with this before. So they put in the bid. They got the contract for $20,000. Now, at the time, Auburn was this tiny little village. It had about 2,000 people. So you can imagine if you've got a tiny little village of 2,000 people and you flood it with $500,000 in funding all at once, with more money to come forever, that's going to completely change the economy.
Mm-hmm.
And that is exactly what happened. So it was created by these white businessmen who had these goods that they basically wanted to sell. So one of them made cotton cloth. Another of them made liquor. And they knew that by creating a prison, there were going to be people coming to town who were going to buy the goods that they manufactured. Another one of the founders of the prison had made, he was investing in real estate. And he figured out that with this prison stimulating the local economy, the value of his real estate was going to rise. Again, this is obvious to us today. It was not obvious at the time. So this was the scheme, and this is what they did, and it worked. And it turned Auburn into a city. It turned Auburn into a major manufacturing location. And here's their second dastardly idea. So their first idea was basically to suck money out of the state and get this state money and use it to stimulate their economy. But then they had a second equally evil idea, and that was to build factories right into this prison. So here they are, they're building the Auburn State Prison, and they build from the very beginning, they build factories into the prison, inside the prison walls. And the whole idea was while they were sucking money out of the state, they were simultaneously going to suck labor out of the incarcerated people. And then they were going to be sucking money. The prison was going to be sucking money out of corporations, which were going to pay for that labor. And then the corporations were going to make the most money of all because they were going to take that prison-made consumer goods
to market
and sell them on the open market. So it was this plot to suck money and suck labor in various directions and make a lot of money. And this is where the whole idea of the profit-driven prison came from. Auburn, New York, early 1800s.
And what was the progression of it as a movement or as a phenomenon in the entire country or in the
Yeah.
culture? From there, where did this notion grow? And draw the line between that uh, beginning and
Yeah.
where we are now. How does
Yeah.
the prison system, the prison business look? And what I hear you saying is that we need to start describing it as an enterprise, as
Mhm.
a business.
Yeah.
And if we change our language of how we refer to it, we might come up with different strategies of how to deal with it going forward. But first of all, recognize it's a business and
Mhm.
it's a big business. But
Yeah. Yeah.
draw the
So,
line.
yeah, let me before I describe how it spread, because it
Mhm,
did spread, and this is a
mhm,
really important part of the story of the book. Before I do say that, let me talk about the importance of language that you just called attention to.
mhm,
Very often, when we think about for-profit prisons, what we're talking about are private prisons. That is to say, prisons where the prison itself is an owned business. It is a business that is owned by some sort of corporation.
mhm,
But the thing is, when we focus on private prisons, we're actually ignoring the vast majority of profiteering that happens through prisons. And
hmm,
so, one of the things that I really want to do in Freeman's Challenge is call attention to the profiteering, to the profit-driven incarceration that happens way beyond private prisons. So, private prisons are generally dated from the late 20th century. That's when private prisons were invented. The Auburn State Prison was never a private prison. It was always a state prison. But that does not mean it was not profit driven. It was absolutely profit driven. It existed from its earliest conception, even before it physically existed, when it was conceived. It was conceived for the purpose of generating profit.
mhm,
It was never outside of that goal. And that's why I called the Auburn State Prison the original prison for profit. It existed for the purpose of profit, but it wasn't a private prison. And so that's, to me, that's really important. Let's talk about the profiteering that happens through state prisons and other non-private carceral institutions. So, to get to your question about how it spread,
mhm,
this is so important. So, the Auburn State Prison creates something called the Auburn System, which is the Auburn system of incarceration, which has a number of features, but one of the really important ones is that the incarcerated people were forced to work in factories, and they were forced to work for private profit. The system spread immediately because once people saw that the Auburn State Prison was doing this and was profiting off of this, then other people wanted a piece of the action. Other states wanted a piece of the action. So it spread really fast. It spread within just a few years. It spread within New York State. It spread within the Northeast, and it spread to the South, and it spread to the West, and then it spread to Europe, and it spread to much of the rest of the world. So when we think of some of the most notorious prisons, these are actually prisons that were explicitly built in imitation of Auburn. They were explicitly built on the quote Auburn system. So when we think about places like San Quentin, for example, or Parchman, or Angola, or Sing Sing, these are all Auburn imitations.
And so take a second and talk about the nature of incarceration prior to that system, because what brought the question to my mind was you said that this model soon was adopted in Europe and other parts of the world. And so looking back 500 years or 1,000 years, what did communities do? How did people organize safety and collective punishment or judgment where they felt it was? What systems were in place, and how has the time uh, reflected the evolution of ideas and ways to deal with conflict resolution and with judgment.
Yeah, that's a
So,
great
so
question.
it reminds me now, I had a chance to visit Ghana a few years ago. And the tour I was with, we spent one half of a morning in a Ghanaian civil court. Interesting, first time in Africa. I'm an African American, right? And I'm sitting looking at the judge and the barristers or the lawyers wearing black robes and flecks and wigs, and thinking this is kind of way out. Why are these black men wearing European wigs as a symbol of the power of the court? So that was one thing, and they went through the processes I recognized. Then we went to a traditional village in Kumasi, and our group had a chance to sit in on a council of elders in a regular meeting. And among the duties of that regular weekly meeting of the council of elders was conflict resolution. And this time there was a dispute between two families over one maybe usurping property or rights or authority of the other. And both had to argue their point. And then the community of elders argued, and they made a decision. And they said that when the decision was made, either the family that was found guilty had to make restitution or compensation or be banished. So that was a system for handling disputes and justice. Maybe you could describe in general how communities handle protecting community and punishing people when there was a community need for some kind of justice or punishment. What do you think?
Yeah, I love that question. The first thing that's really important to say is that prisons as we know them are relatively modern inventions. 500 years ago, there was no such thing as that we would recognize as a prison. Now, systems of justice have always existed, and systems of justice exist in every corner of the world and in every moment in time. So justice is very old. Punishment is very old, and brutal punishment is very old. And punishment relating to work is very old. But what is really new is, first of all, prisons at all. So prior to the invention of prisons, which, depending on how you define them, of course, is basically about the 18th century. Prior to the invention of prisons in the West, in Europe, and also in the the U.S. colonies, the American colonies, the basic unit of punishment had to do with death, really, for many crimes. The basic punishment in the colonies, the American colonies and Europe, was death. And then prisons were invented in part as a reform measure. And that sounds very strange to our ears, but it was invented as a reform measure in part because juries were very reluctant to convict people because they knew that a conviction would lead to death. And so what ended up happening was that a lot of people were just found innocent all the time and they weren't punished at all because juries didn't want to convict. And so prisons were created in part because as a way of having a punishment that seemed, and I emphasize seemed, more mild than death, which in turn would make juries more likely to convict. So there would be more punishment, and the punishment was understood to be more mild than death. So this is a really important idea that prisons themselves were created out of a sense of reform. And one of the points that I make really strongly in Freeman's Challenge is that prison reform in general creates something awful, that prison reform does not work. Prison reform very often, and I have a lot of examples of that in Freeman's Challenge, prison reform often leads to things that are just as bad or arguably worse. And I have a lot of examples of that.
Share what you mean.
Oh, sure. So I'll give you one example. The Auburn State Prison, where William Freeman was incarcerated, the prison that Freeman challenged, and we haven't even talked about the challenge yet, I hope we'll get to that, was an extremely violent place. So all of these incarcerated people were being forced to labor for no money. And it is hard to force people to work for no money, no benefit of any kind, no early release, no special privileges, literally nothing. And so it's very hard to force people to work under those circumstances. And one of the ways that the Auburn State Prison did it, made that happen, was through extreme violence, especially whipping. And at a certain point, so people were being whipped in this prison. And at a certain point, whipping was being associated with the South. Whipping was being associated with the whipping of enslaved people in the South. And at a certain point, that became racially disturbing to white people in the North, because there were, of course, white people in the Auburn State Prison, and they were being whipped also, and often being whipped by white men who were guards. And this became racially disturbing to a lot of people because it was a way of, quote unquote, apparently treating white men like enslaved African Americans. And white people did not like this. So they wanted to come up with a different system of punishment that would still force work, because the whole point was productivity. The whole point was to get people to make products that could be sold at a profit. So the goal was to still force people to work, but to do it in a way that seemed less brutal and less violent, and also that did not seem to hearken to the South. And what they came up with at the Auburn State Prison was waterboarding. They invented a machine that waterboarded prisoners. And William Freeman, I am very sorry to say, a teenager, was waterboarded at the Auburn State Prison. And so this is a great example where people were saying, okay, we have this terrible violence that's happening. Let's make a reform so that things will be more humane. And what they came up with is simply another form of torture. And what I'm really coming out and saying is, torture is torture, and it's always wrong, whether it is whipping or waterboarding. These are both forms of torture. They are both wrong. And if a system cannot exist without torture, the system itself is wrong.
And deserves to not exist.
That's right.
And so it's convenient that as we discover, this new invention of a profit motive fitting into prisons, that the color question really drives the economy of prisons, because it's easy to accuse and to enact, the retribution, having lost the war in the South, getting back in control and having power over the freed or emancipated Africans in prisons were a part of that process. But I think it's important that you are looking at what happened in the North, because the North wants to always wash its hands and say, those people down there, but same people here, same story.
Yep.
And so what surprised you as you did this research? What illuminating ideas that you experienced in the research?
Oh, so much surprised me. Well, one thing that surprised me continually was, as I learned more and more about the Auburn State Prison, and I learned more and more about the Auburn system and how it spread throughout the entire United States, just how evil it was. And every time I thought I fully comprehended just how evil it was, I learned more. And so it was a state of continual surprise. It took me 9 years to write this book. It's a very deeply researched book. Every single word of it is true. And so there were many surprises along the way. But I think the biggest surprises had to do with William Freeman himself. So William Freeman, he's this 15-year-old teenager, a kid. He's free. His father had been enslaved and had become free. His mother had always been free. And he is thrown into this notorious prison that invented profit-driven incarceration. And he is told that his labor is going to be extracted from him for 5 years. And
he's incarcerated because he's accused and found guilty of stealing a horse, right? Is that
Correct.
okay?
Correct. And he was always clear that he did not do it,
Right.
but it didn't matter. And I should also say there was no hard evidence against him. He was convicted really on hearsay. But again, did not matter. He's thrown into this prison. He's told he's going to have his labor extracted from him for 5 years, and he's furious. And he resists. He resists from the very beginning. And one of the ways that he resists from the beginning is he says that he does not want to work. And this alone is very brave because, as I said, the Auburn State Prison was so violent, but also because one of the characteristics of the Auburn system, and this is very hard to take in, was that prisoners were forced into extreme social isolation. They were placed in solitary confinement every single night in such a way that they could not communicate with anybody else every single night. And then during the day, they were forced to labor in these factories together. But, and this is the part that's so hard to take in, they were not allowed to speak at all, ever. And this is, of course, torture. But the purpose of it was not to punish. The purpose of it was productivity. The purpose of this horrible forced silence was to force them to work more. So Freeman is put into this prison. He's 15 years old, and he's basically told, you're not going to speak another word until you're 20. It's so hard to take in, but this is what happened to him. And Freeman, not only did he speak, he spoke up. And he said he did not want to work because he had committed no crime and because he was a citizen. He was a free person. And as a free person, he should not have to labor. And he deserved to be paid for his work. He demanded payment for his work. He said he didn't want to work, but if he was going to be forced to work, he wanted to be paid. And as you can imagine, the retribution was horrific. But he kept at it and he kept resisting. When he was released at the age of 20, he continued to demand wages for what he saw as back pay. In his view, the state had stolen from him 5 years worth of work and therefore 5 years worth of wages, and he deserved back pay. So what he does when he gets out of prison at the age of 20, again, he's still a very young person. What he does is he goes to magistrates and he tries to build a legal case. And he is laughed at and he is dismissed. He spends 6 months telling everybody who will listen and a lot of people who won't listen what his case is and why he wants this. And then William Freeman resorted to violence. And that's the murder that's in the title of my book. The full title of my book is Freeman's Challenge, the murder that shook America's original prison for profit. And Freeman did then commit a murder. And at the point where he committed the murder in challenging this prison, that's when a lot of people got really scared because they could no longer laugh at him. They could no longer dismiss him. Nothing was funny anymore. And they had to deal with his challenge to the Auburn State Prison. And he really did succeed in frightening and threatening the people who ran this prison. So this is the story of William Freeman. And then he went on trial for this murder. And the trial itself made national headlines. It became a huge trial. It was called the Trial of the Half Century. And a lot of really important and interesting things came out of that trial too. So this is what the book is about. It's about this evil system of profit-driven incarceration. And it's about a really brave young person who challenged the system and succeeded in threatening the mighty Auburn State Prison.
How did you run across this story? Maybe you said it earlier, but how did you come across this story and why did it capture your attention?
Yeah.
You devoted 8 years, right? Research and writing. That's a lot.
Yeah.
And I see and hear the passion in your voice, the detail in your voice, and it's amazing. So how did this grab you? How did you make and meet this appointment
Well,
with, with
I
a need that you showed up for?
Yeah, I came across it by accident, and I think a lot of works of history start off with accidents. I came across a footnote that said something that astounded me. What it said was that in Auburn, New York, which I had never heard of, in 1846, there was a theatrical production. And in this theatrical production, a Black man committed a murder on stage. And I was astounded by this because I'm a cultural historian, and one of my areas of expertise is the history of theater and performance. And what I knew was that in the mid 19th century, white people absolutely did not want to see Black on white violence on stage. And they were so invested in not seeing this that they actually used to doctor performances of Othello, William Shakespeare's play Othello, which has a scene of Black on white violence. And what white people so did not want to see that they would actually doctor the play to avoid that. So here is this performance in Auburn, New York in 1846 by white people for white people that is totally centering that spectacle. And I thought, how can this exist? And I also thought, what happened in Auburn, New York, to make white people behave in a way that was so different from how white people were behaving elsewhere at the same time?
What do you mean? Explain that.
Well, white people everywhere else were saying, don't, I can't look at Othello. I can't, I don't want to see white people being hurt by a Black person. That's too threatening. And meanwhile, in Auburn, New York, white people were lining up to see that. So what I knew was that something race shaking had to have happened in Auburn, New York, to make white people behave totally differently from white people elsewhere at the same time. And so I thought, okay, what happened? What happened in Auburn, New York? And I started by researching that show. And the character on stage was based on William Freeman. It was a corruption of him. It was a distortion of him, but it was based on William Freeman, who, again, I'd never heard of. So I start researching William Freeman. Who is William Freeman? What did he do? Why did white people actually want to see this? And that's when I started pulling the thread and learning more and more. So that's where the whole book came from. And that's when I learned that actually Freeman had lodged this challenge to the Auburn State Prison that was tremendously important and forgotten. And that was when I realized, this is a book. This is a book that I have to write.
And that's what you refer to as the Freeman Challenge, right?
Exactly.
Excellent. So let's talk about some of the other areas that you're involved with and come back to this as well. I mentioned that you've mentioned that you are a cultural historian, and I'm looking in your bio, and you've got, besides the book Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit, you've published a book entitled Terrible, Terrible, a Folktale Retold. You've published a book entitled Cast Out, Queer Lives in Theater. And I see one more book titled Racial Innocence, Performing American Childhood from Slavery to Civil Rights. Talk about all of these works, if you would.
Sure.
And how they're all connected. And ultimately, my question will be, is how they come together in Robin Bernstein.
Well, they're all connected in that they're all in one way or another about justice. That's really the connection, and that's really what I care about. Terrible, Terrible is a children's book. It's something that I wrote when I was in my 20s, and I've only written one children's book. Maybe I'll write another one someday, but that's all. So that was something that I did for fun. But as the title suggests, it's Jewish and it's feminist, and it's an updating of a Jewish folktale. So it is interested in justice. Cast Out is an anthology that I edited, and it's a collection of first-person essays by LGBTQ people who work in theater. Like I said, one of my areas of interest is theater, but I'm interested in theater not just for its own sake. I'm really interested in theater and performance as social forces. What I really care about is how theater is a way that people speak to each other about who we are, how we make ourselves communities, how we make ourselves who we are. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so interested in the 19th century, because in the 19th century, theater was doing live stage theater was doing all the work that today television and radio and the internet were all doing.
Mm-hmm.
Theater was how people communicated with each other in public. It was the main organ. So whereas now we email people, in the past, everything was live. Everything was people talking to people speaking in formal ways, people speaking on stage to each other. So that's
and even theatrical troops from town to town, and they
absolutely.
basically were carrying the news of the world.
Exactly. And then racial innocence has a very deep connection to this book. Racial innocence is a history of the idea of childhood innocence. So when we hear the phrase childhood innocence, that phrase sounds racially neutral. But what I show in this book is that, in fact, it's not racially neutral, and it was never racially neutral. In fact, white supremacist ideas have been tucked into the idea of childhood innocence from the very beginning. And by the way, that idea did have a beginning. It's not 1,000 years old. The idea that children are innocent is really only a couple of 100 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a modern thing, much like the prison. It seems like it's always been there, but it hasn't.
Mm-hmm.
So what I show in Racial Innocence is that the moment the idea of childhood innocence coalesced and came to exist, it immediately became a tool of white supremacy. And then it also became a tool that African Americans tried to use to reverse and resist white supremacy. And we can think of things like Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 was an attempt to use the innocence of children to argue for civil rights. So this is the complexity of ideas about innocence. And Freeman's challenge takes up some of those ideas about the difficulties and the problems inherent in claims of innocence. Part of the reason that white people resisted Freeman so strongly, beyond simply the fact that he did commit a violent act, they resisted so strongly what he was doing, in part because he was calling into question their supposed innocence.
Mm-hmm.
The town of Auburn, the entire town, the entire New York State was benefiting economically off of incarcerated people and their labor. And the white people in particular in Auburn were very invested in not thinking about their entanglement with this system that involved torture and that involved racism. They wanted to think of themselves as non-implicated, as innocent. And part of what Freeman did was he called that out. And he was very clear that his target was not only the prison. His target was the entire system. His target was the state. His target was ordinary people who were not directly involved with the prison, but who benefited economically from the general prosperity of the area. Auburn became kind of like a company town. A company town where everybody is connected in one way or another to the central economic engine, that engine being the prison.
And
But
we have those here, and every state has, the system exists.
Totally.
Yeah.
And they wanted to think of themselves as innocent. They wanted to think of their hands as being clean. And that's what he exposed, was that in fact, they weren't innocent. Nobody was innocent.
Mhm.
So that's one of the connections from Racial Innocence, my book, Racial Innocence, to Freeman's Challenge, is that they're both really taking on the claims of innocence that are made specifically by white people. I'm really looking at white claims of racial innocence, and I'm unmasking those claims.
Well, I can't help but pivot to talk about the current political environment that we're in, because that's kind of what's on the table at the moment. There's a propensity, a desire of the far right, from my point of view, to blind itself to the truth and to the evil and ugliness of the motivations. The idea that there's something that they will lose if other people gain an opportunity to pursue uh, justice, peace, and equality. On the other hand, you have a new awakening, I believe, inside the progressive and liberal Democratic Party that I think is fascinating and timely. Um, and so, love to have your thoughts as you have looked at that particular area, and you've looked at culture, and you've looked at feminist initiatives, I think. Uh, One thought that came to mind as you mentioned that, Robin, was this notion of extraction, of the philosophy of extraction of labor, of wealth, of minerals, of assets, and the philosophy of hoarding those things and depriving them simply as a business strategy, a business tool. And on the one hand, the the perpetrators organize themselves in community and culture to absolve themselves of any responsibility. They say, "Oh,
That's
the
right.
land was just laying there. Oh, the native people were not using it. Oh, the Africans were just standing around with nothing to do. Oh, you know, rationalizations that
Mhm,
attempt to justify their intent to exploit and
mhm,
extract
mhm,
uh, the resources of of the world."
mhm.
And so, as you write and as you think, what are you projecting and suggesting as strategies to undo the damage,
Mhm,
to resist the damage? What will resistance look like? You've described resistance in the life of Freeman.
mhm,
What does resistance look like in 2024 in the George Floyd
mhm,
era and beyond? What does it look like
mhm,
in the post-Trump era, hopefully, and in the emergence of new leadership, of new recognition of women's leadership
mhm,
in the world? What do you
mhm.
think?
Oh, it looks like so many different things. Um, there's a prison abolition movement, obviously, and which I think is incredibly important. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is a leader of the prison abolition movement, she has said something very important, which is that prison abolition is not simply about removing prisons. It's about building new systems of justice. It's about building new human societies, new formations of human society in which we care for each other, in which we pursue justice as communities, in which there is possibility for restorative justice, in which there are many, many forms of caring for each other that have the effect of taking away motivations for committing crimes and taking away motivations for violence.
Mhm.
So I think one of the first things that we have to do is build new things. We have to build new systems that enable us to relate to each other in ways that are deeply human, ways that are based in justice and love and community. So these are very, very important things. Speaking to our exact moment, I will say that I am simply ecstatic about Kamala Harris's candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I'm absolutely ecstatic, and she, of course, is a former prosecutor, and she, of course, has sent many people to prison.
Mhm.
And yet, I am ecstatic about her candidacy, and so I hope that that as president, she will get curious about new forms and also long-standing forms of justice that have nothing to do with prisons. One of the central claims I make in Freeman's Challenge is that prisons do not produce justice. They just don't. You asked me earlier about what surprised me as I was writing this book. One thing that surprised me was I had this realization deep into the research. I was reading all of these bureaucratic documents that had been generated by the prisons. Prisons are bureaucracies. They generate a whole lot of texts. And so I was reading all these prison reports. And one day I had this sudden realization that everything I was reading in these reports was a lie. Everything. The purpose of the reports was never to tell the truth. The purpose of the reports was to disguise the truth being that these prisons were sources of violence, of torture, and of theft, the theft of labor and the theft of lives.
Mm-hmm.
And what I hope is that Kamala Harris will become our next president. And I hope that she will get curious about some of the ways in which prisons simply do not produce justice. I believe that Kamala Harris is somebody who cares about justice. And I hope that she will realize that there are way better ways to enact justice than prisons.
How did you choose to become a teacher or student of African American history and culture?
Yeah, it's been an academic subject matter that I have cared about for a very long time and studied for a very, very long time. I'm not African American. I'm not a mixed race person. What I care about so much is justice. And what has drawn me to African American studies is the way that justice is at the absolute core of it. Same thing for women's studies. Justice is at the absolute core of the field in a way that it's not necessarily at the core of many other fields. So that has been
let's sit there for a minute. So what's at the core of the, I'll call it broadly, the Western experience of the way our society is structured in the Americas and in Europe? How would you describe it? Is justice at the core of that or something else? What is it? Yeah.
I would say, I mean, really honestly, I would say that what is at the core of Western culture writ large is colonialism and capitalism. And I mean, that for me, that is what defines Western culture. And what I see in African American culture is an inherent resistance to that, a position that has always been in opposition to that. And even when you have certain individuals, I mean, certainly there are some individuals who are, rah capitalism, certainly. But as a group, as a culture, African Americans are not, as a group, the beneficiaries of capitalism or the beneficiaries of colonialism, certainly not in the same ways that white people are.
Mm-hmm. And so as you think about futures and informed by your research and your writing, what are the options for our country and for our people? And I'll leave the hour open to be as broad or as narrow as you want to make it. What's in the future for our people?
Well, I think one thing that I hope is in the future is certainly Kamala Harris as President of the United States. Let's start there and let's work really hard to make that happen. I have been working very hard to make that happen. I'm sure you have too. I'm sure many of your viewers are working so hard to make that happen. So we've got a couple months. Let's do this. So that's the very first thing that comes to mind. I think a second thing that's really important that I hope is in our future is a radical change in prisons, either the eradication of prisons or at the very least, a huge attenuation of prisons, a complete reimagining of prisons, and certainly the end of profiteering through prisons. And let me just mention very quickly that there are two bills on the that are being debated right now in New York State, and I've been involved with this. Two bills that aim to end forced prison labor in New York. One of these bills is called the No Slavery in New York Act. It is being debated as we speak. And if it passes, it will end forced labor in prisons and other carceral institutions in New York State. It basically will mean that incarcerated people will have a choice about whether to work or not. It will not end work. It will end forced work. And the second one is called the Fairness and Opportunity Act. And if it passes, it will require fair working conditions for incarcerated people who choose to work. And this is so important to Freeman's challenge, because this is exactly, these two ideas were exactly what Freeman was working for. His claims were, one, he didn't want to work. He had committed no crime, and he did not want to be forced to work. But his second point was that he wanted to be paid fairly for the work that he did do. He wanted both of these things. And this is so the fact that it's being debated in New York State right now tells you how far we have not come. But we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to pass these two laws. And by the way, there are similar laws being debated in many other states right now. We have the opportunity right here, right now, to end carceral slavery across all 50 states in the U.S.
Let's leave it right there. Robin Bernstein, she's the author of Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. It's available everywhere. Get it, read it. I'm going to get it and read it. You sent me a copy. I will read it. Robin, I thank you. So good to meet you. Thank you for being here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a pleasure and an honor.
Take care. Bye-bye.
You too.